Everybody, thanks for being patient for this dev update. I've been walking in a lot of stuff, and I've also been building a nice to-do list for next week. So I'm going to go over what I've done this week, and then I'm going to go over for next week. This week's primarily been dominated. I've been working on the exchanges, so I found a bug in the indexing system, but I've never been super happy with the way that some of the indexing logic worked. And I've essentially had one database called _API, if anybody's familiar with it. And this API contains all of the global indexes. For those that don't understand, a global index essentially allows you to know with a single read where something is in the blockchain. Otherwise, you rely on iterating blocks or iterating transactions or iterating sig chains. So name records, for instance, are one. So I've developed I like the indexing system that I have in that sense, where I basically have a polymorphic function that can essentially be inherited by each new API, and you can create your own custom indexing systems. That's how the market works and all of that. But from some of these designs, I've decided I'm gonna revamp a lot of it. So that's one thing that I've been primarily focusing on, is revamping this indexing system. So redesigning the architectures. I guess it's just a feel too. When I look at the code, I haven't been completely satisfied with it. So and seeing some of the bugs, I think we had a bug with some of the credits not firing off for Coinbases. I'm debugging that with Neil, and there's these little idiosyncrasies that happen, and that's usually a symptom of something that's maybe not coded entirely as well as it could. So this is kind of how I go. I just start coding, and if I see something I don't like, I keep doing it over and over until I get it right. So I haven't really revamped the indexing system for quite some time. So it's well and due. So anybody that's had transactions where they notice that they don't credit entirely correctly, this is going to fix all of that entirely. So I'm breaking the indexing system up into an API and a sessions folder. What this is going to allow us to do is it'll allow you to reset the state. Right now, if you have to reset your sessions level indexes, they're all coupled in with the global level indexes. And then it has to rescan the chain and rebuild all those indexes, because it's usually built when it's synchronizing. But if you've already synchronized and you need to rebuild the chain itself or rebuild those indexes, then you've got to go through and start all over again, linear read of all the transactions and so on and so forth. So that's something that I've been getting done. I've been also debugging some of the issues. I think one of the issues that I found is this op ledger timestamp. It's a specific conditional op code that we have in our conditional virtual machine. And it basically takes the timestamp of the ledger in the current ledger. But I'm noticing that that's actually been causing quite a few problems. I'm going to disable that op code in the hard fork and just rely on the transaction timestamp for the caller. But the reason I had the op ledger is because it's something that's reliable and you can't forge it and you can't try to manipulate the timestamps. But I'm going to put some tighter time tolerances in the transaction so that you can't try to make a transaction happen too much in the past when it's actually received into the memory pool, and so on and so forth, and it won't be able to be too much in the future. So this will help with the expiring. It'll help it also if there's a reorganization. I have noticed that a transaction could get reorganized, and if it's an op ledger timestamp and then the new block happens to be right out of bounds of that, then that transaction will never actually get reprocessed. And then that can cause a halt in your sig chain and the transaction processing. So I'm getting all of that put in. This is kind of two-pronged issues. So those are two things that I've been working on this week. I've identified a lot of the issues that we found with TradeOgre and Zedgix. Like as I said, I'm waiting on some fixes from Gerardo for Zedgix. There's some implementation issues they had on their side, and then there was an indexing bug on our side, and it didn't seem to become apparent until the indexes didn't fire off, which I'm glad this happened, though, because we caught this problem early. If it would have continued on, it could have become a much bigger problem. So I'm also working on the fees asset. So what this is going to do, if anybody saw, I made an economics voice memo earlier, but we're going to be putting the fees in an asset. So what this means is that some of these chain state parameters, such as the cost of a namespace or the cost of a name, or even the cost of a global name or any of the other types, these will be actually stored in the chain state instead of a hard-coded variable. So hard-coded means that it's something that's actually a constant that's compiled into the code. So in order to change a hard-coded variable, you have to update the software. And if it's a consensus critical constant value, then that requires a hard fork. So this has been something that I've noticed as the market has gone up. We've always had this issue where the fees were more, tolerable and negligible when the price was low, but then the price goes up and then the fees become a lot more expensive, and then that requires a hard fork to undo. So we haven't really changed the fees for, I think, a year or two, which is good. That I'm glad that we're finally getting this. But what this is going to happen is it's going to make it a dynamic allocation. So with a transaction and a vote from the community, we will be able to say, okay, well, we want to change these fees to this and these fees to that. And without the need for a hard fork, we'll be able to change some of these chain state parameters. Now, this is also another important feature that we're going to be able to be using for other types of chain state parameters, right? I'm most likely going to be adding a few additional ones because sometimes it is advantageous to be able to tweak some of these, such as the minimum stake interval, as far as how many blocks you have to wait for a new stake block, and some of the other fundamental constant values. And this is cool because this allows us to start bootstrapping off of our own blockchain state, which allows it to be a lot more dynamic, easier to change, and ultimately limiting the number of hard forks that we have to do. We want to limit the number of hard forks because it's a big, challenge. You have to take a couple weeks. Everybody has to update, and people don't necessarily always like to have to force updates. So we're trying to minimize that as much as possible. So one thing, big priorities that I have for next week, everybody to know mobile wallet for the iOS and Android are our main priorities. So some of the things that I'm going to be doing that, I'm figuring out this timeouts issue on the client mode. I think some of you that have really large sig chains, if you log in on your client mode, you'll notice your balance may not be entirely correct or some of the transaction history is missing. And that's because this timeout is basically going from the start to the end. So we're doing these different batches of 50 to 100 transactions for your sig chain or notifications. But if there happens to be a hiccup or a slow and the internet is not checking actually the last time that it was received, it's just checking from how long it took for the request to fulfill entirely. It's called a blocking message that I've developed in actually the lower level protocol. And that way we can basically send a request out to another node and wait for a response, and it'll block waiting for that, which is really useful for the API if you're wanting to load any state from the chain that you need to wait on from another node to deliver it to you. So that's essentially how the client mode works. So that's something that I think has been an issue. But what I'm also going to be doing is I'm going to test all of the features in the API in client mode. Once I get that, I'm going to get the iOS, which I need to make sure that I get some of the initialization code working better, make sure that's running really solid, actually running directly on my device, and then Android, obviously, and then fixing some of the timeout issues. But I want to run every API command, such as running invoices, and make sure everything is running completely solid in there. Ideally, I would like to see at least my back-end work done on the mobile wallet by the end of next week so that we can be ready to deploy those onto the app stores. I think it's time. I appreciate everybody's patience on the matter. And it's going to be good to get that all done. So one of the big hurdles I've had is getting the build environment set up and then all the others. And, setting my priorities, I think, has been another challenge of mine as well, because there's so much going on in my head and so many things I see to do. Setting the ones that are the most conceivable, reachable, and brings the best benefit to you guys. And so that's one thing I've also been working on and developing this week is setting my priorities correctly and making sure that I'm executing on those priorities and setting my own internal deadlines and all of those good things. So hopefully we should be seeing a lot more progress next week. As I said, I'm going to be doing these development updates every Friday. If they're late at night, it's because I've usually been working all day or I wanted to get something done before. So I apologize if this is too late for some people, but I guess you will get it as your Saturday morning. So anyway, as I was saying earlier, with the indexing, I'm going to be breaking the API into essentially a session and an API database. So this will help rebuilding indexes much better, revamping the indexing system, and then this also is something that's heavily relied on for the client mode. So between all of those things together, I think we will have a much more solid back end. And then we'll want to get everybody testing. We're going to release a new beta, ideally by the next time I do a development update. So if everybody could really help on getting those tested out and report bugs so that we can make sure we get all of that squashed, because we need to get these mobile wallets out. There's been many people that have been asking and saying this is our highest priority and most important. There's also some new use cases that I'm developing, not me personally, but somebody in the community has actually been forging connections with in South America. And these are going to potentially be really amazing, beautiful use cases, but we need to get the mobile wallets completely out and ready to go so everybody can use it. That's going to be a big, big slice of cheese for us, but once we get it, I think it's going to open a lot of doors for us. So what I would ideally like to get to next week, this is something that I've been working on kind of in the back burner. It's a branch called Merging TLS, and you won't see a whole lot of commits on there because I'm essentially deciphering this. It's called embed TLS, so I'm having to basically convert this old embedded TLS library into replacing a lot of our OpenSSL functions. So as everybody knows, I'm working on getting OpenSSL almost completely eradicated from our core. Getting rid of the legacy transactions, that will be one major step towards it. And then we just have to support the Brainpool 512T1 curves. And as we natively support the Falcon sign algorithms, which I think we use Falcon 1024. But anyway, another big feature that I'm actually focusing on as well, along with all of that, is signature aggregation. This is going to be a big one. It's going to save a lot of disk space. Essentially, a signature chain is a link. It's like your own blockchain. So one of the beautiful things about this is that you can chain the signatures together. You know that if the very first signature, the Genesis, is included in a block and it has a valid signature, and you know the very last transaction of the SIG chain is included in a block and has a valid signature, you don't need to have all of the signatures for every single transaction between those 2 points. So for instance, a Falcon key, I think, is about 800 bytes for a public key, and I think it's close to 900 bytes, about 1.5, 1.6 kilobytes for the public key and the signature. This is one downside to quantum-resistant encryption, is it's usually a lot larger key sizes, which means that you're going to have more disk space utilization. But what this is going to do is it gets you aggregation. So if you have 10 transactions in your SIG chain, let's just say 1.5 kilobytes for, or 2 kilobytes, let's say, just for a more conservative number. 10 transactions means that you're going to have 20 kilobytes of data that's going to be included on the blockchain state. That's going to be saved onto your disk. You do 100, you have 200 kilobytes, and you do 1,000, and you have 2 megabytes worth of signatures. So 1,000 transactions in a SIG chain is really not a large SIG chain. Some people can have multiple stakes per day. I've seen some SIG chains that have 5 to 10,000. But as I said, 2 megabytes of data. Now, when you only have to aggregate the signature chain with the first and the last signatures in the chain, then voila, you have now saved 2 megabytes of data. Now multiply that by 1,000 people, now you've saved 2 gigabytes of disk space. So this is a huge feature as far as really taking advantage of our signature chain architecture so that we can know for sure that we don't have to consume more disk space than we really need, and that it remains the same level of security. There's a few more nuances than just that. It's not quite so cut and dry on first and end, because you do have to keep a number of signatures available until a checkpoint, until the chain can't be rolled back past that point, because if you do have a reorganization, then you do need to have those signatures so that you can continue to maintain that head of the chain. So these are things that I'm thinking about all the time, and this is something that I'm actually really excited to get put together. On to the use cases. As I was saying, there's a couple of use cases we're exploring for the next couple of weeks. Gig economy and even potentially, local economic systems. We're working on kind of developing little microeconomies. Anybody has any ideas too? We're trying to figure out if you develop your own local currency that ends up being something for a town or a city or a state even, you can create a lot of economic value for people, but we want to figure out, besides just transaction fees, a really helpful way that when these microeconomies are created is going to boost their own local economic production, because they're not going to be tied to the existing currency system. But how are we going to bring this into Nexus? This is something that we're wanting to look into, because we want all of the use cases in some way to tie back in to provide liquidity in a Nexus, which is ultimately going to help the price maintain its value or increase in value, which is something that's going to then bring us a more liquid market. And when we have a more liquid market, then it's more usable as a currency, and so on and so forth. So that's something, food for thought. That's something that I've been brainstorming with somebody in the community about. Like I said, if anybody has any fun ideas feel free to jot them down here in this channel about how creating your own token to represent some sort of microeconomy can bring liquidity into Nexus, because there's a lot of places that could actually use developing their own local currencies, and you create your fiat on and off, and you create kind of a stable coin. But with these stable coins, besides transaction fees, because we want these people to be able to transact for free, how are we going to drive liquidity into Nexus from that? It's a good question. We're still working on the answer, so I can't say that we have it, but we're working on it. But I just wanted to put that out there for anybody that wants to mull on it or has any great ideas. Please do let us know. On to the artificial intelligence use case. I'm currently modeling a very basic neural network based off of a control. So my algorithm essentially is using more structured mathematics to create more structured, predictable neural pathways rather than unpredictable ones, which also allows us to not have to compute for every single one of these neurons. You only compute a specific path, which is a mathematical structure. So ultimately, what this is going to do is it's going to save us this exponential time calculation. As long as these paths become ideal and it actually provides, a greater intellect, we're going to save substantial amounts of computing power. And what this means is that if we can get our algorithm, let's say, doing 100 times faster than your typical artificial intelligence algorithm, the hardware that is used to train and run these then becomes 100 times more valuable. So an H100 is about $25,000 US, which is a very popular graphics card for actually training these AIs. So now take 25,000 and multiply it by 100. You have $2.5 million, which is a very large amount. That's essentially the amount of hardware. You've taken one card, 25,000 worth, and it now has the power of $2.5 million worth of hardware. So this is also a huge step for democratizing AI and making it put in everybody's hands. Most of the AIs are closed source, closed box. They have their own neural nets and everything like that. But what we want to do is put that in everyone's hand. But even more so, we want to make them safer and more predictable. That's a big issue with MIT, is that they have no idea how these things wire themselves. There's a lot of money being thrown at it right now to understand that. We're looking to solve that. And like I said, through the proper structured mathematics and predictable neural routes, we're not going to necessarily be able to predict it entirely. You're going to have some sort of standard deviations off of that. But based off of that, we're going to have more predictable. So I just wanted to say more. Not necessarily it's going to be predictable, but that's hitting a really, really strong value proposition. So, like I said, I'm developing this with a control, with a typical neural network architecture, sigmoid activation function, and then comparing that with our structured mathematical neural networks and calculating the number of iterations that it takes to reach a certain level of training data and to reach a certain level of accuracy. And that's our control, comparing it against, so that we can compare our algorithmic improvements. Now, ideally, we would like to see, as you add more neurons, it usually scales exponentially. What I mean by that is it's exponential time. It takes exponentially more resources the more neurons you add. Ideally, we would like, if this works as we anticipate, to have that scale more linearly. We want to have more linear time scaling, which means that the hardware that's required as far as hundreds of thousands of H100s may not be necessitated at this point, which really opens doors for everyday mom and pops to actually be able to start to have these powerful artificial intelligence systems that can help start running their businesses or anything else. I think the blockchain hype, at least what it was in 2018, is not what it used to be. I think a lot of people have explored what it can and can't do. And blockchain's always going to be around, but with Huacta coins and all these other meme coins and all this madness, I think there is a large amount of the population that is, disenfranchised from it, disenchanted from it. And so we're looking for the proper liquidity providers. Like as I was saying earlier about having use cases, microeconomies that can provide liquidity into the Nexus token. Ideally, we would like to see the same thing with this artificial intelligence. And as I've said earlier, we have massive amounts of idle hardware. Now imagine where, everybody wanting to deploy their own AI has to buy Nexus in order to do so. I think this is going to generate a huge amount of liquidity and, basically be the petrodollar for Nexus. And this is something I've been talking about for a long time that we need to find, is we need to find something that allows us to, reach this something that allows us to basically reach this new liquidity that's just this bridge between using it as a currency and it being just something that's a speculative instrument. Bridging that by having utility. And I said this many times, and the utility that we're really, I think, is going to be our hot one is, as I said, artificial intelligence and this network that we're creating. So this is something that I've been doing on the side. Anybody that's concerned if I'm not spending as much time on Nexus, I'm doing my best to spend equal time, if not more, on Nexus. Nexus is actually the more important one right now. This other one, though, we are working on getting funding for it. And so we're going to be seeing that start to come to fruition a lot more, but they are quite symbiotic because the more matured this new network we can get that's going to be built on Nexus, then the more liquidity will drive into Nexus, kind of like I said, the petrodollar. And so once the markets become more liquid, then it becomes a more viable instrument for currency exchange and using it as actual currency. Until then, our liquidity is based completely on speculation, maybe transaction fees, maybe how people use it, but we want that to be based off of actual use. And I believe artificial intelligence is going to continue to grow over many decades to come in ways that I don't know if blockchain was capable of doing, but with the combination of the two together, I think we have a very, very powerful tool that can solve a lot of significant issues. Anyway, moving forward, hard fork. I'm working on this next week as well. What we're doing, we voted on it. There's 16 million coins in legacy. We're going to truncate. Basically, all of those coins were lost, and that's the difference between the actual coins on Tritium and the coins on legacy. So if you still have coins on legacy, move your coins out, okay? We're going to be taking the difference of how many's on Tritium and then the total money supply, and that's going to mint out a certain amount of coins. If you want to see in the trading channel, we had a vote on it, and everybody really unanimously agreed. We want to lock a bunch of that away, 10 to 12 million, into a kind of satellite war chest. And that's going to just basically sit in a locked account that'll be unspendable, that will sit there until we reach a certain price point so that we can use that to start to deploy our own satellites. As I was saying in some of the general channel, I'm going to reach out to the original satellite vendor. We spent about $30,000 on the Nexus 1 and see if they potentially would provide credit. There's no guarantees on that. But ideally, we would like to see at a certain price point, and this is something that we can all discuss together, what price that we want to start launching Nexus 1. Generally, satellite vendor has launch services built in, or very simply, you just piggyback on a SpaceX rocket. That's what everybody does. It's not a big deal. It's really easy to do, but I would like to start seeing that in the pipeline at some point in the future so that it can be on our roadmap. So if you guys want to start thinking about what price you think we should launch Nexus 1 at, that would be a really good discussion to have. It would be great to have that up. I mean, it's not going to be an incredibly functional satellite. It'll, fly over you every once in a while, and you may be able to up and down link data to it. We can do some fun stuff with that as well if we want to have it, represent something. It may not necessarily be running blockchain per se, but we can do some fun stuff with the satellite. Maybe use it as an encrypted messaging system, and then it can pick up messages and then deliver them, store them forward, however we want to do. But that's another important one to put into the pipeline. As I said, probably around 10 to 12 million that we're going to be having locked up for a certain price point. And we should develop these price points to know how we're going to deploy each one of these individual satellites. And, at 25 cents, we launched Nexus 1. 50 cents, we launched Nexus 2 and 3 and 4. So on and so forth, et cetera, et cetera. And as I said, 5.8 gigahertz is what we're going to be using. That's an ISM frequency. The Nexus 1 prior was a UHF VHF. It stands for ultra high frequency, very high frequency. And it's basically ham radio. And so you need an amateur radio license. ISM frequencies, you don't need that. It's a really important distinction, and it's a really important innovation that we're going to be driving forward with this. So anyhow, there's also some other redistributions that are going to be happening. Some of the developers are going to be paid for some of the back pay. I'm going to be paid back for some of the amounts of Nexus that I actually put towards the project through, I think it was like 2019, 2020, to basically get Tritium over the line. And that's really good because we've, not going to lie, we've had FOMO in 2021 with the price going up, and it's hard for us to get a stack. So I think that'll be really good for everybody to know, too, that the developers are well taken care of and we're highly motivated. The other things that we're going to be doing is we're going to be developing an exchange war chest. So right now we have two offers for exchanges, MEXC and DigiFinex. Now the listing fees are rather large, but we're from what we've discussed with the team, we're going to be going with MEXC. They have a refundable security deposit that's going to be in USDT Tether. So that's going to be pretty much one of the first uses of some of those funds beyond the funds that are going to be locked up for the satellites, so that we can get on a really good top tier 1 exchange. I think that's going to change an incredible amount of things to be on much more reputable, higher volume exchanges. So that's our primary pursuit as far as exchanges. Then we can start getting into other ones. If you guys want to get us on Bybit, we need lots and lots of community activity, and we need lots of volume. So keep telling your friends. Let's keep building volume, keep building liquidity. We'll eventually be able to get to Bybit, but the market makers that we've discussed with said that Bybit is very difficult to get on. And I think they've just been getting bigger and bigger, so it's most likely harder and harder. But we're up for a challenge, right? At some point, we'll be able to maintain that. So that's something to look forward to in the future, something that we're going to want to be developing towards, right? And I think that's something that I think will be really inspiring for all of us, is to have things that we know that we're all working towards. What would also be good is in the community, if there's any bounties or things that you guys believe should be done that could be really cool community activities, please write it in this chat. And let's start building a bounty list, because now that we'll have more of these funds available, we can start building bounty lists, and we can start creating more incentives for other people that want to get more involved or want to earn a little bit more Nexus. Let's really get that kicking. Having funding limited as we have for the past 4 or 5 years, as far as the emission, has been something that has been a challenge for us. But with this legacy unburn, this really opens up a lot of doors for all of these things to be possible that we had once wished to be possible. Now, for anybody that's concerned about that, just so you know, these funds are not going to be hitting the market. Basically, 10 to 12 million are going to be locked up entirely until a certain price point. And then the developers, the little stacks that we receive, that's going to be held. We're going to be staking that. We want to also show we're not here to spend that. That's our stack for as we grow. There might be some liquidity depending on how MEXC uses to use. We have to give them some of the Nexus coin as well, or the Nexus. And then we also have to get Tether. So for anybody that's open to it, we're going to be doing a crowdfund for the MEXC listing, which will essentially be an over-the-counter trade to get the listing fees so that none of that touches the market. We don't want to touch the market at all. So figured all of you guys, if you want to get some Nexus for cheap before we get listed on a tier 1 exchange, that'll also help us get listed on the tier 1 exchange. It's a double whammy. Please be open to communicating that. So this will all be happening after the hard fork. Once the code is deployed, we're going to be doing a test on the testnet, doing the hard fork, activating on the testnet, making sure everything goes well. And then once we release that wallet update, it's going to have a time activation. It's going to be most likely 2 weeks from that point. And that means that you will have 2 weeks, if you still have legacy coins, to move your legacy coins into a Tritium address. Otherwise, those coins are going to be considered gone. Anybody that doesn't transfer any coins, you have to have a certain measure to know, hey, these coins were burnt. So that's going to be our time limit. So between now and when the wallet's released, you've got time if you still are holding on legacy. And once that is released, we'll put a little timer in the wallet to let you know, to make sure that you switch over. And if you use legacy mode, that will also tell you to move all of your coins. Big warning messages. We want to make sure all of that's clean. There's not going to be any coin that's minted. All we're going to be doing is taking the difference between the actual supply and then the supply that's on Tritium, and that's going to become the new mint. And we're going to have it minted in a decentralized way to different addresses and different wallets. And like I said, I'm going to make a special account for the satellite funding that will be unlockable at a specific hard fork in the future. We're going to be having more hard forks because we're going to be adding more features, such as augmented contracts and all of this. So we want to create that assurance so people know that we're going to get the best of both worlds. We can recover some of these lost coins, but then in a way that it's not going to create any negative economic impact. Right now, those coins are already out of circulation. So if we removed them, from the supply list. It's not going to change our economics in any way, shape, or form. It's just going to change the psychological belief of it. Since everybody's already pretty well attuned to how much Nexus is in circulation, it would seem silly to not essentially utilize that for all of these purposes that we've described. So as I said, if you want to verify the poll, it was done in the trading channel. We had actually a very high voter turnout compared to normal polls, and it was pretty close to unanimous in favor. We want to get on new exchanges. We want to get our satellites off the ground, and we want to make sure that all of the people that have been working hard for Nexus are taken care of as well as they've been taking care of us. So this has been my progress update for this past week, and I will give another progress update next week. I'm going to start taking this format where I tell you what I've done for the week and then tell you what I'm going to do for the next week, and then we can compare and you guys can check and say, hey, Colin, did you achieve this and achieve that? And anything falling behind, then we'll push that on to the next week. Ideally, I would like to be knocking out all of these goals for the next week. So as I said, ideally, I would like to see the mobile app pretty much ready to pack and ship. So by next Friday, which means we'd have new betas, and we'll want to test that out for a week at least after that, make sure all the bugs are fixed. Get exchanges back online. As I said, removing up Ledger, breaking up the indexing database into API and sessions, and fixing some of the, like I said, issues in the timeout for the blocking message to make it block not based off of when the message is received, but to when it's going to be finally, when there's a change in the actual state or a new message is received, because you could have a list of like 100 transactions and you want to set the timeout based off of each transaction that's received, not after the entire list. So, and then again, the fees asset for the hard fork so that we can dynamically modify the fees and potentially some change state parameters. And within the next few weeks, we're also going to be getting more clarity on some of these new use cases. And so that essentially wraps us up for this week, and I will speak to you guys next.